Hi everyone, this is Kyle, and I have this one interesting resurface interview coming from Lord of the Rings film trilogy screenwriter Philip Boyens. Now this article here, it's from boundingintocomics.com. Lord of the Rings film screenwriter Philip Boyens explains why Tolkien's stories are so beloved. He didn't compromise anything. Me, I'm a Tolkien fan, so I of course want to go into this, but this brings up one question that I'm going to raise here, which is, would today's publishing industry accept Tolkien's works as they are? I don't think they would, for a number of reasons that I'll go into. I mean, I think a lot of the things that made Lord of the Rings such a classic story, such a timeless story, a lot of things in Lord of the Rings, the publishing industry today, as far as I've seen, I don't think they would accept at all. Alright, so I'm going to read over this article a little bit. So we begin. Lord of the Rings trilogy screenwriter Philippa Boyens shared her thoughts on why she believes Tolkien's stories are so beloved. Boyens' comments about Tolkien's story came back in 2003 while she was promoting the final film of the trilogy, Lord of the Rings Return of the King. Great movie. I mean, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, they might be some of they're arguably the best movies ever made. I mean, sure, they're not completely 100% accurate to the Lord of the Rings books, of course. And yes, just for the record, Christopher Tolkien, who was very protective of his father's works, God loved Christopher Tolkien, he did not like Peter Jackson's trilogy. So that all needs to be said here. But objectively, Peter Jackson, there's no question he respected Tolkien, and he did his very best to create a good, faithful adaptation of Tolkien's works. Her comments were recorded at the time by the OneRing.com founder Jonathan Watson and recently shared to YouTube. Boyens was asked by one of the reporters what she meant when she previously described Tolkien as an amateur writer. She responded, "What we mean by that is that he didn't set out to write a novel in the same way that professional writers do. He's not a novelist. He's an incredibly, I would say, almost unsurpassed storyteller. And that to say he is an amateur, it was only to the extent that I think that's where a lot of the heart of the story came from. Well, the truth, it's an incredibly truthful story, and it's not slick. He needed an editor, God knows the amount of repetition we came across when you actually get into those books, and was a big problem for us," Boyens continued. And yes, there is a lot of detail in the Lord of the Rings books. There's no question about that. And this brings up probably the first couple of reasons why I don't think today's publishing industry would publish Tolkien's works if he were alive today. At least not without putting their fingerprints, their dirty fingerprints, all over his books. So right here, I have just a little list here of the word counts for The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Hobbit, 95,000 words. Fellowship of the Ring, 177,000 words and change. Two Towers, 143,000. Return of the King, 134,000 words and change. Now, just for the record, I have two books that I've published. Part of the fantasy series, The Drifter's Road. First installment is The Fleeing Company right here. Second installment is The Tempter's Bane. And they're both available at Amazon.com. Now, regarding major publishers out there, I decided a long time ago that I do not want a major publisher laying a finger on my stories for a few different reasons. But I wouldn't say that I've really followed the publishing industry too much. I've kind of just had my head down working on my own stuff. But I do see things every now and then. A couple things I'm going to say here as to why I think the publishing industry would not accept Tolkien's works today. Number one, you look at the word counts here. Whenever I've looked up literary agents online, it's been a while since I've done that, but one thing that I always read was they want your books to be lean, they want them to be definitely no more than 100,000 words, and they probably want them to be even shorter than that. I think probably 75 or 80,000 words at most. And Tolkien's works here, the Lord of the Rings books, they average probably a little over 150,000 words. That alone, you're probably not going to see any literary agents or any publishing companies taking on Tolkien's books if he were alive today. Granted, the first book, The Hobbit, 95,000 words. That's under 100,000 words, but if I were to take a guess, I'm going to bet you they're going to look at that alone and they're going to be like, this is too long, we don't want anything to do with this. And the other thing I'd say in regards to the word count here, Tolkien's works have a lot of detail to them. There's a lot of description, there's a lot of poems, things like that, a lot of verses in there, songs and whatnot. There's a lot of stories and legends in Lord of the Rings books. It is a really, really, really rich story. From what I've seen, however, of the publishing industry today, again, they want your books to be lean. If I were to take a guess, if they were to read Tolkien's works, they would probably want all of the rich detail in Lord of the Rings cut out. They're going to want just non-stop plot the entire time. I mean, I've read some people who have experience with publishing saying that, they want stories to be fast-paced. They don't want stories to be slow at all. They want stories to be tense from the very first page to the very last page. And would I consider Tolkien's books to be like that? Probably not. But I mean, all that detail he put in there, all that richness in Tolkien's stories, that has a lot to do with what made it such a timeless classic, Lord of the Rings. And I bet you if today's publishing circle were to consider publishing Tolkien's works, if Tolkien were alive today, they would probably want all that rich detail cut out, and they would want his stories to be turned into just, non-stop, fast-paced plots that are tense from the very first page to the very last page. I mean, those are just a couple reasons why I think today's publishing circle, if they were looking at Tolkien's works today, they would completely overlook one of the greatest stories ever written. Alright, so I'm going to continue here. The screenwriter then shared, and a lot of stuff he did in reportage, like, he had a great idea that instead of going back and rewriting, like, for example, you could tell that suddenly he had this wonderful idea of how Gandalf escaped from Saruman. Why didn't he do that whole Saruman-Gandalf confrontation live? Why didn't he follow Gandalf too? Why was it in the reportage? And I can't help thinking that things like that, or certain things like that. Well, I mean, Gandalf's not really the main character. Frodo, I would say, is the main character. And probably the hobbits are the main characters, I suppose, but, I suppose maybe I could see your point here. Suddenly he has this great idea, so he decided to tell it as reportage instead of taking you there as the audience, she observed, and I think an editor would have said, take the audience and tell the story from that with more immediacy. Maybe that's what an editor would have said. It would have been easier for us. However, she then posited, but then, that was his privilege. I think what's so great about this is that he didn't compromise anything. He told the story the way he wanted to tell it, which is why it is as rich as it is, and why it is as personal as it is, because it's a very personal story. The stuff in the book that works best is that it is very, very personal. I think the relationship between Frodo and Sam, the whole tragedy of the Shire, was very different. It was very much things that he genuinely felt, drawn from his own personal experiences. Which is why it's often, I think, it's what you can contribute to the success of these stories too, she declared. And this is an interesting point here, because you do have certain people out there that are going to make fun of fantasy fans and things like that. People who like to read fantasy books, or I don't know, play Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. I don't play Dungeons and Dragons, or what else is there? World of Warcraft or stuff like that. I don't play those games. When I write my own books here, I take influence from I read a lot of old fairy tales, old European mythologies, things like that. I have to be honest, I've been pretty busy lately. It's been a little while since I've read anything, but I try to read stuff whenever I can. But Lord of the Rings, it takes place in a completely made-up world, and yet the characters and the struggles they go through, the adversity they go through, it feels very real. And you can very easily relate to, their struggles, that sort of thing. Frodo has to destroy this ring, and to do that he has to go into the very heart of Mordor, Sauron's kingdom. He's got all kinds of people hunting him, ring wraiths and whatnot. And he's just an average hobbit. He's just an ordinary person doing extraordinary things. That's one thing that I think I like a lot about Lord of the Rings. And this theme right here, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, I question whether this is something that people in the publishing circle will actually like in a story. People in the publishing circle, people in Hollywood, you might call them a bit more elitist, whereas Tolkien, he was not that way at all. Tolkien was more of an ordinary person. People in the publishing circle, you might argue they prefer to talk about kings and people that are higher up in society, so to speak. And instead, the heroes in Lord of the Rings, they're hobbits. Just simple folk. Is that a type of theme that people in today's publishing circle like? From what I see, I'm not so sure they like that at all. I don't think they do. One of the reasons, another big reason why I don't think today's publishing industry would accept Tolkien's work, the themes of Tolkien's work, I don't think align with what the publishing industry generally wants. Tolkien's more traditional, it's more wholesome, good and evil type of story. You see a lot of the more timeless themes in Tolkien's work, like courage, selflessness, friendship, family. Tolkien was a very devout Christian, and people in Hollywood, people in the publishing industry, I would say they are the very antithesis of that, of what Tolkien stands for. I mean, they tend to prefer George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones over Lord of the Rings. I mean, whenever I was looking up literary agents for my books, and this was years ago. I mean, since then, I've since decided a long time ago. I'm like, no, I don't want anything to do with the major publishing industry. But whenever I saw them talking about fantasy, and they talked about good fantasy books out there, they always brought up George R. R. Martin. They never mentioned Tolkien. And one thing that I have found, at least from people that I've read, when they give their advice on writing fantasy books, one common theme I see is having similarities to George R. R. Martin, the more modern, morally gray type of story. A lot of vulgarity, a lot of adult bedroom activities, and things like that. A lot of R-rated stuff. I mean, having similarities to George R. R. Martin, I found, has been very, very highly encouraged, whereas having similarities to Tolkien has been very highly discouraged. Tolkien, the more traditional good and evil type of story, it's not modern by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, men were masculine, women were feminine, women were, you had Eowyn fighting, of course, but, the genders did more traditional roles for the most part. Good and evil instead of being morally gray. You don't have any political allegories or anything like that in the story. You don't have any woke nonsense in there or any woke lunacy either. And whenever I've read anybody give advice on writing fantasy stories, people that are in the major publishing circle or close to, I mean, whenever I read them, whenever I have read them, they've generally said do not have so much as one similarity to Tolkien, basically. You can be like George R. R. Martin, but Tolkien, if you have one similarity to him, your story's a rip-off, essentially, is what I've been hearing. And granted, these are all my impressions. I mean, if any of you out there write fantasy books, you'd have to listen to what I say. You'd have to agree or disagree. You'd have to judge all these things for yourself. Again, these are my impressions. But again, the themes of Tolkien's work, they are, and the values Tolkien had, they don't align with Hollywood. They don't align with the publishing industry as far as I see. I mean, I tell you this too. I mean, people do make fun of Lord of the Rings fans. People do make fun of fantasy fans. I think people do make fun of Tolkien making a whole... I mean, he really didn't write a fantasy. He wrote a mythology, as Peter Jackson once put it. But, people criticize Tolkien's works for being very, very escapist and, that sort of thing, which, having nothing to do with the real world, that sort of thing. The irony of those criticisms is that Tolkien lost his father when he was 4 years old. He lost his mother when he was 12 years old. He then fought in World War I. He was in the trenches in World War I. He lost two of his friends, Geoffrey Beige-Smith and Robert Gilson. Robert Gilson being son of principal at King Edward's when Tolkien attended that school. Geoffrey Beige-Smith, he was a poet. Tolkien published his works after the war, after Beige-Smith died. The book's called The Spring Harvest. I have it. He's a real good poet. Yeah, and then Tolkien, he lived through World War II. So in other words, Tolkien saw far more of the real world than his critics did. Alright, I'm going to continue. Not only did Boyens explain why she believes the Lord of the Rings novels are so beloved, she also shared her thoughts on why the film adaptations have been so successful. And the people got into the spirit of what Peter was trying to do, don't you think? Which is tell these stories as if they were real, Boyens said. Find the honesty in it so that it is real sentiment, not sentimental. That's not manufactured emotion. Peter hates that. She then commented, in fact, he always destroys my stuff like that, which is great, which is what a writer needs. And he makes you go deeper. He makes you find the truth of that moment as a writer, which is great, which is what you need. Because, boy, I could churn out, some stuff that you can. You can do it off the top of your head. It's probably good enough for some people, but it's not good enough for Peter or Fran, actually. And here's a little picture here at the end of Lord of the Rings when they're at the Grey Havens. And I tell you, the Lord of the Rings movies, they would not get made today in Hollywood either. I mean, this brings up my next point, is that all of entertainment has gone woke, as they put it. I mean, I've said before, the people in Hollywood, the people in entertainment, they are not entertainers. They are activists first. Their priority is to put their ideology into everything they get their hands on. Their woke ideology, their identity politics, their left-wing ideology, their feminist ideology, you name it. I mean, that I'm just calling a spade a spade. That's who they are. Those are the facts. I just work here. But the publishing industry, everything I've seen, it's basically the same thing. I mean, they obsess over surface level traits. What's your race? What's your gender? Things like that. What's your sexual orientation? I mean, if you see this picture of Tolkien right here, if you notice one big detail, he is a white male. That one trait about him, that alone gets him rejected by the publishing industry, at least from what I'm hearing. He's also a straight white male. He was also a very devout Christian. I mean, he is everything that entertainment hates. Those things alone, yeah, I don't think they would accept his works. I don't know if they'd even consider accepting his works because of all that. And as I've already stated, I mean, the themes of his stories go against everything the publishing industry likes in a story. I mean, if they did consider Tolkien's works, I mean, they would be putting their fingerprints all over The Hobbit, all over Lord of the Rings. You know, they would be trying to check boxes off. They would make sure it's diverse and things like that. Even though Tolkien's works, they are based on European mythology, European folklore. They would probably make sure that a couple members of the Fellowship are gay. They would probably make sure that a couple members of the Fellowship are women. You know, and so on and so forth. I mean, they're going to be trying to check boxes off for no other reason than to check boxes off. They're probably going to try and change the story. They're probably going to try and inject some messages into there. I'm sure they'll try and put stuff like feminism in there. I mean, if they read the one part in Return of the King with Éowyn killing the Witch King, what do you think that today's publishing industry would try and do with that scene? You imagine that? I mean, Tolkien just had Éowyn say this one line, "I am no man, you look upon a woman." I bet you people in the publishing circle, they would try and take that much farther than that. They would probably try and turn Éowyn into a feminist icon. Oh, Frodo and Sam, I guarantee you they'd make Frodo and Sam gay. You know they would do that, because they were such close friends, and the logic people in entertainment today have, if two guys are friends, they must be gay, period, end of discussion. That's another topic for another video, though. There's another article on Bounding into Comics talking about that very subject, Frodo and Sam, and I'll be doing a video on that. But again, Tolkien's works, the publishing industry today, I think they would, well, number one, they would see that Tolkien is a white male, a straight white Christian male. That alone, they probably reject him. If they do take a look at his works, they look at the word count, that alone, they probably reject him. They see that it's not fast-paced, and they see there's a lot of detail that isn't directly related to the plots, and that would lead them to rejecting Tolkien's works. They would see that it doesn't have any messages in there. They might reject it for that, or at the very least, they would try and put their fingerprints on his story and really fundamentally change them. And as Philip Boyens said up here, one of the reasons why Tolkien's stories were so beloved, he didn't compromise anything. I mean, if a publisher was trying to put their fingerprints all over Tolkien's works, he wouldn't accept it at all. I mean, there have been a couple of attempts to adapt his books into movies back in, the 60s, and the people who were working on the scripts, Tolkien read them, and he just shredded them. Yeah, I tell you this, folks, I mean, thank God Lord of the Rings was published back in the 1950s, because today, I don't think today's publishing circle would publish his works as they are. Just like I say, thank God the Lord of the Rings movies were made 25 years ago and not today, because if they were made today, they would not be as good as they are. I mean, I'm not really a fan of anything that's coming out today. I mean, there are some good things, but I'd say generally speaking, you probably got to go to independent creators in order to find good stuff nowadays. And me, again, I have my own books here. I didn't originally start writing them because of all this nonsense that's taken over entertainment. But I tell you this, when you consider how entertainment has gone downhill today, I mean, it's absolutely an added motive for me to write my own stories. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you consider hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you all very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.